The fire was already halfway up the front porch by the time the neighbors noticed the orange glow in the sky, and even then nobody moved quickly enough to stop it, because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened on this street, but it was the first time it would leave blood in its wake, and someone watching from the trees already knew that it wasn't just a house burning, but a fuse being lit that couldn't be undone. Inside the house, the smoke moved like fingers reaching for something to take with it, memories soaked into floorboards, pictures curled up in frames, shelves filled with stories and symbols, and a silent strength no one outside this home had ever truly understood. And in the middle of it all, a small wooden box lay untouched by flame just yet, but that would change soon. A dog barked 3 houses down, but its owner yanked the leash quickly and pulled it inside, and the street returned to the eerie silence it knew too well, the kind that crept in when people saw something they didn't want to get involved in, something that smelled like trouble, or worse, like justice coming. 3 men in dark hoodies jogged down the sidewalk laughing, one of them clutching a red gas can that sloshed with each step, and the tallest of the 3 stopped just under the broken streetlight, turned back toward the fire, and snapped a photo of the rising flames before jogging again to catch up with the others. And behind them the house began to groan the way homes do when their bones are being broken and their history is being erased. He wasn't supposed to be home tonight, but he was. He had come back for the first time in months, because something in his chest had told him to, and now he stood in the trees just behind the backyard, watching it all, watching the smoke and the sparks and the destruction unfold in silence, with eyes that didn't blink and fists that didn't shake. They didn't know who he was. They thought he was just another face. Another quiet man who never raised his voice, never complained, never called the police, no matter how many slurs were painted on his fence, or how many garbage bags were thrown in his driveway, or how often his mail was stolen or destroyed. They thought he was weak, but he had been trained in silence for years, and in places the average person couldn't point to on a map, and every scar on his body told a story that would have made these men turn and run if they had known. Now he watched his past burn in front of him, the walls he had rebuilt with his own hands, the porch swing his mother had once rocked him on, the kitchen table where his sister told him she was pregnant, the same table he had laid his medals on the night he swore he was done with violence and done with war. But sometimes war comes back for you, even when you've walked away from it. Behind him the night was still, but his thoughts raced like thunder across open desert land, and he could hear the sound of their laughter still echoing, and that sound was louder than the fire and hotter than the smoke. He stepped forward just enough to feel the heat on his face and let it remind him of the things he had survived, the things they didn't know about him, the things no one in this town ever cared to ask. The sound of a child crying 2 houses away made him stop again and close his eyes, and when he opened them, the flames had touched the roof and the smoke curled into the sky like a warning. He didn't cry, didn't scream, he just turned slowly and walked away from the fire with smoke in his lungs and war in his veins. Men who did this thought they'd just sent a message to someone who would leave quietly, who would pack up and disappear the way so many others had done before him. But they were wrong, because he wasn't planning to run, not this time. This time someone else would be running, and he would be watching, because when you destroy the home of someone who has nothing left to lose, you don't just start a fire, you start a hunt. And this hunt was already underway. The motel room smelled like bleach and silence and old secrets, and he stood by the window with the curtain barely open, staring out into the parking lot where headlights came and went like ghosts, and no one noticed the man with the tired eyes and the hands that hadn't stopped trembling since the fire, though the tremble wasn't from fear, it was memory, the kind that lived in his bones and came alive when it smelled smoke or gasoline, or heard the sound of men laughing in the dark. He hadn't called anyone, not his sister, not his old unit, not even the one man who owed him everything, because this wasn't about asking for help. This was about watching them first. He had names known, not full names, but nicknames and voices, and the way one of them limped slightly on his right leg, and how another smoked menthols with a nervous twitch and always scratched his chin when he lied. He had watched from across the street the next night when they gathered behind the bar on Miller Avenue, drinking cheap beer and retelling the story like it was some kind of victory, a war story shared between cowards and the kind of men who only feel strong in groups they didn't know. He was already there, listening from the shadows. He saw their faces clearly now, and he was building a map in his mind of who they were, where they moved, who they answered to, and why they had chosen him. It wasn't random, it never. Isa neighbor told him once there were whispers about his past, about where he had gone for those missing years, and why he never talked about them, and some people in town didn't like not knowing things. People like these men who thought America belonged only to them, men who forgot that sometimes the quietest one in the room is the one who's been trained to clear a room without making a sound. He opened the drawer beside the bed and took out the old notebook he hadn't touched in nearly a decade, and flipped it open to a blank page with hands steady, now calm like the ocean just before a storm, and he began writing their descriptions. Every detail, voice, scent, habit, route, and pattern, not for revenging, but for precision. This wasn't going to be reckless or loud, this would be surgical, the same way he had been taught downstairs. A woman argued with someone on the phone, and a baby cried, and the vending machine groaned as someone shook it, and he listened to it all with the patience of a man who had once gone 3 days without moving in the jungle waiting for a single target to appear. That part of him had gone to sleep when he came home, but the fire had woken it back up, and now it was hungry. He left the motel just before midnight, moving through side streets and alleys like he had 100 times before, in cities that never knew his name, and he stopped just outside the backyard of the man they called Razor, who was drunk on his porch laughing into a phone, bragging about what he'd done. He listened, he waited, he memorized the names Razor dropped, and the threats he made, and the fact that Razor had no idea he was already being watched. He could have ended it, they could have walked through the shadows and broken Razor into silence, but that would have been too fast and too easy, and it wouldn't stop the others. He needed more, he needed the route, he needed to know who taught Razor to burn the house, because Razor didn't plan things. Razor followed orders just like he used to, just like every soldier in every war. He left without a sound and returned to the motel by 2 a.m., sat on the floor and stared at the list he'd made, now with 5 names, 3 locations, 2 unknowns, and 1 patent. The same man was always in the background. Man in the red pickup, the man who never drank but always paid for the others, the man who watched but never laughed, the man no one knew by name but who carried himself like someone used to giving orders and expecting them to be followed. He was the real target, and finding him would take more than just eyes. It would take remembering things he had buried, the things they made him forget when they sent him home with a medal and a warning to stay quiet about what he'd seen in the last operation. Had promised he wouldn't. Till now the war had followed him home, and the silence they asked for had turned into smoke. He went into the bathroom, turned on the light, and stared into the mirror, not at his face but at the scar just under his jawline, the one that never faded no matter how many years passed, the one that reminded him of who he had been and what he was still capable of becoming. The next morning he walked into town wearing a different face, not literally but emotionally. His posture had changed, his walk was slower, more broken, like a man still in shock. He let people see him, and he watched who looked away and who stared too long and who whispered when they thought he couldn't. Here he walked past the diner where an old man raised a coffee cup in silent respect, and the woman sweeping the front stoop gave a small nod as if she understood something others didn't. And then he saw her, the girl from the neighborhood, the one who used to draw chalk hearts on the sidewalk and wave every time he passed, with her backpack bouncing and her eyes always full of questions. Now she was older, quieter. She crossed the street when she saw him, not out of fear, out of shame, because her brother was one of them, and she knew what had been done, and she knew he knew it too, but he said nothing, just kept walking. And as he walked he felt the heaviness inside him settling into focus. This wasn't just about the house anymore, where it was about the lie they had built around him, the image of a man they thought would never fight back. They had no idea they had lit a fire in someone who had once been trained to put fires out by lighting bigger ones elsewhere. And now it was his turn, one name at a time, one truth at a time, until the man in the red pickup was the last one left, and by then it would already be too late for him. The diner smelled like coffee and cheap hope, and the sound of forks scraping plates was just enough to drown out the low murmur of guilt that clung to this town like fog. And when he stepped inside, people turned, but no one said anything, because they didn't know what to say to a man whose life had turned to ash. While they slept and did nothing, he didn't sit at the counter or near the windows. He chose the booth in the back, where shadows were thicker and people were easier to watch, and from there he scanned the room slowly, like he used to in places where a second too slow could mean never getting home again. He was waiting for someone, but not to meet them, just to see them, because the man in the red pickup came here every Thursday at 8 a.m. like clockwork, and he always ordered the same thing, and tipped the same amount, and sat at the same booth near the window where his back was never exposed. That was a military habit, and he knew it the moment he saw it, which meant this man wasn't just a local thug or some bitter old racist with too much time and not enough conscience. This man had training, real training, and that made things harder but also more familiar. The red pickup pulled into the lot just as expected, clean, polished, always parked backward for a quick getaway, and the driver stepped out, slow, deliberate. His boots, military issue though, worn differently, and the way he scanned the lot before entering told him everything he needed to know. This man wasn't just dangerous, he was careful. He was someone who understood consequences, which meant he had something to lose. That was the first weakness. The second was the waitress who brought him his coffee before he even sat down, and smiled too quickly, like someone trying to convince herself of a lie. And when she touched his shoulder, it wasn't affection, it was fear. He watched the exchange closely. They weren't lovers, they weren't family, but there was a history, and that meant leverage. He waited exactly 7 minutes after the man sat down before he stood and walked past him slowly enough to be noticed but not stopped, and as he passed, their eyes met, and the man in the red pickup blinked. Once, then twice, like a system glitching, because he recognized something, not the face but the presence, the weight of it. The way men who had been trained in violence could sense another. He didn't stop walking, just pushed the diner door open and disappeared into the sunlit street like he had done nothing at all. But it was enough, because later that night, when the man in the red pickup pulled into his driveway and looked across the street, he saw a shadow in the alley, and for a moment he stood frozen, like prey, unsure whether it had been spotted or not inside his house. Lights turned on and off in different rooms, but no one came to the door, and he watched the alley for 20 full minutes before finally going inside without turning his back. On the street the message was sent, and it said everything without a single word back. At the motel he unfolded the map again, not just of the town but of the people, the connections, the secrets, and he drew a line from the red pickup to the waitress, to a storage unit on the edge of town that no one visited except late at night. That would be the next stop here. Left just after midnight, walking, not driving, not drawing attention, and when he reached the unit, the lock was old but freshly used, and the dust around it was disturbed, like someone had been in recently and not careful enough. He picked the lock in under 20 seconds, not because it was easy, but because muscle memory is stronger than rust, and when the door creaked open, what he saw inside made something shift in his chest, not anger, not fear, recognition. Old military gear, maps, files, pictures, and one photo of him in front of his house before it was burned, taken weeks before the fire, and marked with red ink on the edges, like it had been passed around or studied. This wasn't personal hate, this was calculated. He hadn't been targeted because of a random act of racism or some drunken street gang. He had been profiled, track selected, and that meant this went deeper than he thought. Someone had been watching him long before the fire, someone who knew what he used to be, what he used to don't, wanted to make sure he never became that man again. But now they had failed, because the fire didn't erase his past, it awakened. Ith took pictures of everything inside the unit, careful not to touch too much, and then locked it again on his way out, without leaving a single trace, and he walked back with his mind full of names and his heart full of something colder than Rajit was purpose. He hadn't felt it in years, but it was back now, and it was clear he wasn't just going to find out who lit the match, he was going to find out who gave the order. The next morning he stood at the top of the hill that overlooked the town and watched the sunrise like a new beginning that still carried smoke in its light. And he thought about his mother, and how she used to say that the truth always comes out when the light gets tired of hiding the lies. He whispered her name like a prayer, and promised her grave that this time he wouldn't run, not from the truth, not from the war, not from himself. Down below, the town moved like nothing had changed, but he knew better, because behind every quiet street and every polite smile was a truth no one wanted to speak, a truth about who gets protected and who gets punished, a truth about who gets watched and who gets erased, truth about what this town really was beneath its painted fences and fake apologies. He picked up a stone and clenched it until his hand went white, and let the pain remind him he was still here, still standing, still ready. Back at the diner, the man in the red pickup sat in his usual booth, but this time he didn't drink his coffee right away. This time he kept looking toward the door, waiting, wondering, fearing, because now he knew the Man they had burned out wasn't gone, he was watching, and he wasn't alone. There were others, old friends, old debts, old ghosts, and one by one they would start to surface, because when a soldier comes home broken and silent, the town thinks he's finished. But when you take away everything he loves and try to bury who he was, you don't destroy him, you release him. The rain came without warning that night, thick, heavy, cold, as if the sky itself had broken open and decided to wash the guilt off the streets of the town that refused to admit what it had become. And the man stood just outside the abandoned church, where no prayers had been answered in years, holding a folder in his hand that trembled, not from fear, but from memory. Inside the folder were names, and not just any names, but military IDs, old mission logs, and redacted files with signatures blacked out, and ink so smudged it looked like someone had tried to drown the truth instead of erase it. And yet one name remained untouched. The man in the red pickup. It wasn't just a name now, it was a connection, and the folder proved it, because in a file marked Operation Stonevale, his name appeared next to another name he hadn't heard in years. Briggs, the one man he thought had died in Syria, the one man he had left behind after a mission gone sideways, and an order that should have never been given. And now it was clear that Briggs hadn't died, but disappeared into a life built on shadows and whispers. And now he was here, pulling strings from somewhere close enough to burn down homes, but far enough to never be seen. The man exhaled, slow, deep, controlled, because the discovery didn't surprise him as much as it should have. It only confirmed what his gut had been screaming since the fire. This wasn't about race alone, it was about sex, about something buried deep that someone didn't want unearthed. And now that silence was starting to crack, he left the church without touching anything else, the folder now hidden beneath his coat, and his boots sinking into the mud with each step, like the earth itself was trying to pull him back down. And he let it for a moment, letting himself feel the weight of the past, without trying to run from it. Had followed orders once, trusted men like Briggs once, given everything for the flag once, but now he trusted nothing except the fire inside him. At the motel, a message waited for him, slipped under the door, written in shaky ink on a torn napkin with only 5 words: "They know who you are." He froze, staring at the words as the silence in the room thickened like smoke, and for a second he thought about who had written it. The girl from the street, the old man at the diner, waitress with fear in her eyes. Someone was trying to help, or trying to warn him. He burned the napkin in the sink, watching it curl and blacken until nothing remained, and he turned back to the wall where his map was growing thicker, lines connecting names, faces, streets, files, a web spinning tighter and tighter around one truth. Briggs was alive, and Briggs was hunting him through other people's hands, but he wasn't going to hide anymore. He walked to the storage unit again, this time in the rain, his hood up and steps slow as headlights passed without slowing. And when he got there, he picked the lock again and stepped inside, just long enough to plant a small device in the corner, a tracker, because the man in the red pickup would come back. He needed control, and when he did, he would unknowingly carry that device all the way back to wherever Briggs was hiding. He returned to the street with rain dripping from his face like sweat from a soldier in the desert, and for a moment he stopped at the remains of his house, now nothing but blackened beams and melted memories, and knelt where the front door used to be, placing his palm on the earth, not mourning, listening. And the earth answered a whisper of vengeance. In the dark he stood again and walked to the edge of town, to a trailer park near the woods where rumors lived and secrets whispered through cracked windows, and found the man they called Switch, a hacker, a recluse, a paranoid genius with scars on his arms and old secrets in his eyes. They had served together once briefly, long enough for trust to be earned, and now it was time to collect his Switch let him in without a word, and they sat in silence as the computer booted up, the room lit only by the glow of screens and the sound of old fans trying to keep up. He handed Switch the folder, didn't explain, did need to. Switch read faster than most men think, and his hands moved like machines as he pulled up files, photos, digital fragments from military servers no one should have access to. And then he stopped there, a video file enlisted, dated 3 months ago, footage of the man in the red pickup meeting with Briggs at an airfield, shaking hands, exchanging envelopes, standing beside a white van that had no plates and no markings. They spoke in low tones, but one phrase was clear: take care of him before he remembers. The screen froze on Briggs's face, older but unmistakable, the same eyes, the same mouth that once smiled before giving orders that got civilians killed, the same man now giving new orders to bury old mistakes. Which leaned back slowly, lit a cigarette and asked if he wanted the video deleted or saved. He said saved, not for revenge, for proof, because justice wasn't always about the kill, sometimes it was about the revalent. This was the truth. They tried to bury a truth that could burn more than homes, it could burn legacies. He left the trailer park before dawn, the video now on a drive in his pocket, and a plan forming. With every step he wasn't going to disappear, he wasn't going to strike from the shadows anymore. He was going to walk into the light with the truth and see who flinched. But before he could move forward, he needed one more thing: answers from the man in the red pickup, not through observation, not from distance, but face to face, because no war ends without a conversation between enemies, and this was war. Now the man in the red pickup sat in his car that evening, parked near the high school, smoking, with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking and eyes locked on the rearview mirror, and for the first time he looked afraid, not because someone was watching, but because he didn't know where the next hit would come from. He had made mistakes. Sloppy, trusted Briggs too much, believed the lie that this was just about control and not cleanup. Now it was too late, because the past was awakened. It was walking toward him from across the parking lot. The man whose house he burned, the man he thought was broken, the man who now stood in the rain beside his door and knocked twice before opening it, without waiting, without asking, just stepping inside. Him silent, still waiting, because now it was his turn to talk. The rain had stopped, but the silence inside the red pickup was louder than any storm ever could be, and the man behind the wheel gripped it so tightly his knuckles looked bloodless, while the man in the passenger seat sat still, calm, hands on his knees, gaze locked ahead, not looking at him, not pressuring, just waiting, because sometimes the waiting breaks a man faster than violence ever could. He wasn't afraid of what the man might say, he was afraid of what it would cost to hear it too. Shouldn't be here, the driver said, voice low, cracked like old wood, but the reply came without hesitation. Maybe you shouldn't have burned down my house. And that silence came again, the kind that sucked all the oxygen from the air until it felt like breathing was but didn't mean for it to go that far, the driver said. And that was the first lie, because he knew exactly what he was doing the moment he handed that can of gas to Razor and told him to make it look random. But it wasn't random, and it never had been. Briggs had given the order, and he had followed it like he used to follow every order, back in uniform, back when disobedience meant death or disgrace, and he had convinced himself this was no different, that he was still serving something bigger than himself, protecting something sacred. Except now the mission was control and fear and silence, and that didn't feel sacred anymore. Briggs said, you remembered something from Syria, something buried in that last op, the one nobody talks about. And he said, if you started digging again, if you came back and opened that past, it would unravel things, dangerous things that powerful people promised would never see daylight. The passenger said nothing, just breath, just stared. So the driver kept talking, because he couldn't stop now, not after carrying this weight through every smile, every fake apology, every gas station coffee, every prayer he never believed in. We didn't know they were civilians, that was the line they were told, but he knew it was a lie. Even then, those weren't enemy fighters in that house, they were witnesses to a deal made behind closed doors with men in suits who never stepped foot in the dirt, but made choices that cost lives. And when Briggs realized those people were talking, he sent in the team to wipe them clean. And they didn't wipe clean, they butchered. And someone recorded Ita, young boy hiding under a bed with a camera so small it looked like a toy, and that footage disappeared until someone started asking questions, until someone started remembering. The driver looked at him now, eyes bloodshot, full of something that could have been guilt or fear, or maybe both. We thought you had it, that you took the footage, but you vanished. And Briggs got nervous, started cleaning house, and your name went to the top of the list. The fire was supposed to scare you out of town, it wasn't supposed to start a war. The man finally turned to him, and his face didn't hold hate, it held clarity, a sharpness that sliced deeper than rage. You brought war to my doorstep, he said, voice steady. You lit the fire, and now you expect to control how it spreads. The driver said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. He had confessed, maybe not everything, but enough to see that he wasn't just a puppet. He was a man who traded silence for security, and now he was watching that trade fall apart. The man in the passenger seat opened the door and stepped out into the night, his footsteps slow, heavy, like every one of them was carrying a memory that didn't belong in daylight. And he didn't look back as the red pickup disappeared into the dark. Back at the motel, he didn't sleep. He replayed the conversation over and over in his mind, the confession, the names, File Briggs Operation Stone of Ayland, the boy, the one with the camera knife. That footage still existed. It was the only thing that could destroy everything Briggs had built since that day, and if it didn't exist, then this entire fight was built on ash and broken faith. He called Switch and said one word: searched. No explanation needed. Switch was already scanning dark networks, government ghost archives, underground servers, locked behind walls built by people who never expected anyone to come looking at. 2 hours later, he called back, got something Loris, time-stamped, tagged under a coded label, not a full video but enough to see boot screams, blood on walls, and a child's hand shaking as the camera caught faces. One of them was Briggs, the man who just confessed. But then something else appeared. A logo, not military private, a black wolf head on a silver triangle, a PMC private military, and that changed everything, because it meant this wasn't just a rogue mission, it was a paid hit by people outside the chain of command, and if they were still operating, then this town wasn't just a hiding place, it was a staging ground, a cover, and that meant Briggs wasn't the only one who needed to be exposed. He needed to find the boy, or what happened to him, because the recording ended before anything was clear, and if that boy survived, he was the key to everything. Switch traced the IP of the upload somewhere outside the city, rural land, private property, and marked, but with just enough signal to show someone lived there. A cabin maybe hidden in the woods, and it matched with a name from the folder. Last name Rahim, no known relatives, but tagged as present during the Syria operation. He left without hesitation, didn't take weapons, didn't take backup, just a photo, face, the image of a boy now likely grown who had seen everything and maybe carried a silence heavier than his own. The woods were quiet when he arrived, too quiet even the animals held their breath. He approached the cabin, slow, steady, nothing in his hands, nothing but truth in his voice, as he called out, "My name is Elijah, not here to hurt youth." There was no answer, but a shadow moved behind the curtain. Fine with fighted, and finally the door opened, not wide, just in a fan. A young man stepped out, dark hands trembling, but not from weakness, from years of hiding. "You were there," Elijah said, and the boy, now grown, nodded, one slow, heavy, like the weight of it all was finally too much to carry along. "I have the rest of the footage," he said, "but if I give it to youth, you'll kill me." And Elijah stepped forward, looked him in the eye. "Then they'll have to kill me first." Cabin was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, and Elijah stood by the fireplace watching Rahim pack the hard drive into a small metal case, hands shaking, breath shallow, eyes darting toward the windows every few seconds, like he expected the trees to move, like he expected the silence to break, like he knew the second this drive left the cabin, everything would change and nothing would be safe again. Rahim had lived in the dark for years, built a life out of hiding, changed names, erased records, taught himself not to flinch at every knock on the door, but he had never forgotten. And now, with Elijah standing in front of him, someone who had been part of the same lie, the same mission, the same betrayal, it all came back. "You saw it," Rahim said, voice brittle. "You were there." Elijah nodded, and I didn't stop at that sentence sat between them, not as blame but as weight, because both of them had survived something neither of them had chosen, and survival comes with its own scars. They had 40 minutes before the next satellite pass, which had warned them the upload needed to happen in a blind zone, otherwise the signal would be traced back to fast and no one would get a second chance. Luki looked at the metal case, then at the forest. "There's no safe place left, so we make one." They moved fast but quietly, Elijah leading Rahim through the woods on paths only someone trained to disappear would know, and every branch that snapped underfoot sounded like a shot, and every gust of wind felt like a warning. They reached the clearing just before dawn. Switch had rigged a secure uplink, a portable node buried beneath rocks masked by signal blockers, and by the time they opened the drive and started the upload, Elijah could already feel the weight shift around them, like something had woken up and was coming for them. The red pickup arrived, first headlights off, engines silent, gliding down the old trail like a ghost, and from it stepped a man, no longer shaking, no longer insured, the same man who had once lit the match, now walking toward the flame he never thought would burn him. He looked at Elijah, then at Rahim. "Want this to end, then help us," Elijah said. "Help us finish it." Behind them the signal hit 20%. The man in the red pickup raised his hand and called out into the trees, "We're done, no more guns, no more running." For a second nothing moved, then 2 men stepped out, black suit, empty eyes, guns drawn but not firing. Yet Briggs always sends someone. Elijah said, too afraid to face the fallout himself. The red pickup man nodded slowly. Yes, not far, he's watching, and if that hits 100%, he's done. The agents stepped closer, their voices cold and practiced. Hand it over now, and this ends. Clear, no one has to die. Rahim stepped forward, tired, angry, shaking, but not from fear. From fire, I've already died 1,000 times. You don't get to ask me for silence. The lead agent raised his weapon, but the red pickup man stepped in front. Not this time, not again. They're right, we can't keep burying bodies to protect men who play God with other people's lives. Had stepped between them all and spoke loud enough for the forest to hear. This ends today with truth, with all of it behind him. The signal hit 60%. The agents hesitated, looked at each other, then at the trees. A radio crackled. Briggs's voice, cold, flat, sharp. Take the shot. But the agents didn't move because something had shifted. The fear wasn't in the cabin anymore. It was in the transmission, the truth being born in real time. Every second the upload ticked higher was a second of power being ripped away from the shadows and handed back to the light. Briggs screamed through the radio again, take the shot, then spot. The agents looked at Elijah and saw not a soldier, not a target, but a man who had lost everything and still stood still. Fought still, bled truth, and they lowered their weapons. The radio went silent. 80% went nearer him, stood beside Elijah now, his hand on the drive, his eyes no longer shaking. And when the upload hit 100, the forest exhaled. Somewhere miles away, a server lit up, screens flickered to life, newsrooms got emails, archives opened. The footage became public. Briggs's face filled the world, his orders, his lies, his betrayals, all of it. Elijah closed his eyes and let the weight fall away, not because it was over, but because the silence was finally broken. Rahim looked at him. What happens now? Elijah turned toward the pickup man. That's up to us. They walked back to the cabin slowly together, 3 men connected by fire and truth, and something deeper than revenge, something that looked like redemption. Briggs was arrested 3 days later, trying to board a plane with a fake passport and a pocket full of secrets. The town changed, not overnight, but it changed. The diner stopped whispering. The girl on the sidewalk waved again. The house that had burned was rebuilt, not just in wood, but in respect. And Elijah, he stayed, not to hide, not to forget, but to heal. Came back sometimes. Switch visited once with a printout of the news headline that read, the truth they tried to burn in. The red pickup man, he left the keys on Elijah's porch with a note that simply said, thank you for waking me up. Sometimes justice doesn't roar, it breathes. It walks quietly into the heart of a storm and waits until the storm surrenders. And sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who never wanted to fight, but chose to because silence had gone on long enough. The end, you saw it, Rahim said, voice brittle. You were there. Elijah nodded. And I didn't stop at that. Sentence sat between them, not as blame but as weight, because both of them had survived something neither of them had chosen, and survival comes with its own scars. They had 40 minutes before the next satellite pass, which had warned them the upload needed to happen in a blind zone. Otherwise the signal would be traced back to fast, and no one would get a second chance. Luki looked at the metal case, then at the forest. There's no safe place left, so we make one. They moved fast but quietly, Elijah leading, Rahim through the woods on paths only someone trained to disappear would know, and every branch that snapped underfoot sounded like a shot, and every gust of wind felt like a warning. They reached the clearing just before dawn. Switch had rigged a secure uplink, a portable node, buried beneath rocks masked by signal blockers, and by the time they opened the drive and started the upload, Elijah could already feel the weight shift around them, like something had woken up and was coming for them. The red pickup arrived, first headlights off, engines silent, gliding down the old trail like a ghost, and from it stepped a man no longer shaking, no longer insured, the same man who had once lit the match, now walking toward the flame he never thought would burn him. He looked at Elijah, then at Rahim. Want this to end? Then help us, Elijah said. Help us finish it. Behind them the signal hit 20%. The man in the red pickup raised his hand and called out into the trees, where done no more, guns no more. Running for a second, nothing moved. Then 2 men stepped out, black suit, empty eyes, guns drawn but not firing. Yet Briggs always sends someone. Elijah said, too afraid to face the fallout himself. The red pickup man nodded slowly. Yes, not far, he's watching, and if that hits 100%, he's done. The agents stepped closer, their voices cold and practiced. Hand it over now, and this ends. Clear, no one has to die. Rahim stepped forward, tired, angry, shaking, but not from fear. From Fayev already died 1,000 times. You don't get to ask me for silence. The lead agent raised his weapon, but the red pickup man stepped in front. Not this time, not again. They're right. We can't keep burying bodies to protect men who play God with other people's lives. Had stepped between them all and spoke loud enough for the forest to hear. This ends today with truth, with all of it behind him. The signal hit 60%. The agents hesitated, looked at each other, then at the trees. A radio crackled. Briggs's voice, cold, flat, sharp. Take the shot. But the agents didn't move because something had shifted. The fear wasn't in the cabin anymore. It was in the transmission, the truth being born in real time. Every second the upload ticked higher was a second of power being ripped away from the shadows and handed back to the light. Briggs screamed through the radio again, take the shot, then spot. The agents looked at Elijah and saw not a soldier, not a target, but a man who had lost everything and still stood still. Fought still, bled truth, and they lowered their weapons. The radio went silent. Tatipus went nearer him, stood beside Elijah, now his hand on the drive, his eyes no longer shaking. And when the upload hit 100, the forest exhaled. Somewhere miles away, a server lit up. Screens flickered to life. Newsrooms got emails. Archives opened. The footage became public. Briggs's face filled the world. His orders, his lies, his betrayals, all of it. Elijah closed his eyes and let the weight fall away, not because it was over, but because the silence was finally broken. Raheem looked at him. What happens now? Elijah turned toward the pickup man. That's up to us. They walked back to the cabin slowly together. Three men connected by fire and truth, and something deeper than revenge, something that looked like redemption. Briggs was arrested 3 days later, trying to board a plane with a fake passport and a pocket full of secrets. The town changed, not overnight, but it changed. The diner stopped whispering. The girl on the sidewalk waved again. The house that had burned was rebuilt, not just in wood, but in respect. And Elijah, he stayed, not to hide, not to forget, but to heal. Came back sometimes. Switch visited once with a printout of the news headline that read, the truth they tried to burn in the red pickup man. He left the keys on Elijah's porch with a note that simply said, thank you for waking me up. Sometimes justice doesn't roar, it breathes. It walks quietly into the heart of a storm and waits until the storm surrenders. And sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who never wanted to fight but chose to be, because silence had gone on long enough. The end.